Hey, this is a practice long FRQ, and I chose the 2015 question number one. And I chose this one because it sticks to the curriculum that we actually should have learned for the test. Oftentimes, the long FRQ throws in stuff regarding international trade. And since that is in Unit 6 and not on the 2020 test, we're not going to worry about that. So I think this is a good example of a long FRQ. Unfortunately, though, it does have some graphing in it, and so that throws off how accurate it is for showing what this year's test is going to look like, because this year's test will not have any graphing. But I think these are good questions that we might see in a long FRQ. Long FRQs oftentimes deal with recessions. They oftentimes deal with monetary and fiscal policy. They usually deal with aggregate supply and demand. While we don't draw the aggregate supply and demand graph this year, we might still talk about aggregate supply and demand. And I think this FRQ shows that pretty well. So it says that we're supposed to assume that the United States economy is operating below full employment. Below full employment is a way of saying we are in a recession. So we're supposed to draw a graph of aggregate supply and demand with all the correct labels. Obviously, that's not going to happen this year. But if we drew that graph, it should look like this. We've got aggregate demand down to the right, short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply. We've got a short-run equilibrium to the left of full employment. That is an economy in recession. If we did that on the actual test, it would have been worth 2 points, I think. But this year, that's not going to happen. So we move on to Part B. Part B says, assume that the Federal Reserve targets a new federal funds rate. Remember, that is the rate that banks charge each other for loans, but that is a rate that usually mirrors the discount rate. Anyway, they target a new federal funds rate to reach full employment. Should the Federal Reserve target a higher or lower federal funds rate? And we would write this out in a sentence, but they would target a lower federal funds rate. If there's a lower federal funds rate, then that increases lending between banks. And if we increase lending between banks, that should make it easier for banks to also pass on new loans to consumers or to businesses. When we're in a recession, we want to lower interest rates. Part C, given the Federal Reserve action you identified in the previous, draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the effect on the nominal interest rate. Again, this has us drawing a graph, and that's not going to happen this year. But if we drew that graph, we're looking at this one right here. This is the money market. We've got quantity of money, nominal interest rate. Demand is traditional down to the right, but the supply of money is a vertical line wherever the Federal Reserve decides to put it. So if they're targeting a lower federal funds rate, we're going to see the supply of money increasing. That gives us a lower nominal interest rate as well. So while we don't draw this graph, I think it's possible in this year that they might ask about the effect on the nominal interest rate. And so we might want to know that graph just so we can get to the right answer. But we might, in this year's test, write something like nominal interest rates would decrease. And in 2015, when this question was given, students did not need to write that line. Instead, the graph just showed that happening. But I think this year we're more likely to see a question where you're not drawing the graph, but you're still writing this as you're explaining what happens to nominal interest rates, given the Federal Reserve targeting a new lower federal funds rate. All right, moving on. Part D, this is getting into a calculation. I think these kinds of calculations are going to be very likely to come up in this year's test because this is something you can do without graphing. And it's just a nice numerical value that they'll be able to check pretty quickly. And so this says that the policymakers pursue a fiscal policy rather than a monetary policy. So we're going to ignore the stuff we just did, and now we're going to look at it from the fiscal policy side. We're going to assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. We know, by the way, that if the MPC is 0.8, then the MPS is equal to 0.2, because those add up to 1. And the value of the recessionary gap is 300 billion. This is a way of saying that the recession that we're in, which we drew up in part one, that recession is a $300 billion recession. We would need to increase GDP by 300 billion to get back to the full employment level of output. Now, if the government changes its spending without changing taxes, to get rid of this gap, we need to calculate the minimum required in government spending. So I'm going to take this down here so we've got a little bit more room to work. In a previous video, I taught that we could do something like the total stimulus is equal to the initial stimulus times the multiplier. And in this case, we're talking about government spending. So we need the spending multiplier. Spending multiplier, or K, is equal to 1 over the marginal propensity to save. The marginal propensity to save is 0.2. I'm going to change initial stimulus just to I, and total stimulus to T to keep this a little bit simpler. 1 over 0.2, in my head, I would do that as 1 over 1 over 5. 0.2, or 20%, is the same as a fifth. 1 over 1 over 5 is 5. And so we need 300 billion. 300 billion is equal to the initial stimulus times 5, which means that the initial stimulus must be equal to 300 billion divided by 5, which is $60 billion. We might write that out in a sentence at the end, that the initial stimulus would need to be $60 billion. Back up here. If the government changes taxes without changing government spending to eliminate the recessionary gap, will the minimum required change in taxes be greater than, smaller than, or equal to the minimum required to change government spending in Part D1? Explain. So this is another big one. We're going to come down here for it. So this is saying, like, if the government does this not with government spending, but with a tax decrease, a tax refund, do they need more money, less money, or the same amount of money to reach that $300 billion total stimulus? And so this is all really similar, except if we're looking at the tax multiplier. The tax multiplier is negative MPC over MPS. And so that tax multiplier, in this case, is equal to 0.8 over 0.2, which is equal to 5, which is equal to 4. Meanwhile, when we do the spending multiplier, was 1 over 5, which was equal to 5. And so this tells us that the spending multiplier of 5 is larger than the tax multiplier of 4. So therefore, you need more money for a tax stimulus because the tax multiplier is smaller than the spending multiplier. If you wanted to explain why the tax multiplier is smaller than the spending multiplier, you could also get credit for that explanation there. If you were going to say, like, when people get a tax refund, immediately some piece of that becomes savings before it can be used to stimulate the economy, and that's why the tax multiplier is smaller than the spending multiplier. If you had that kind of explanation, that would get credit. Or if you've just shown that 5 is greater than 4, or if you've defined these using the formulas of 1 over MPS versus MPC over MPS, any of those can be used for your explanation of why you would need more money as a tax stimulus than as a spending stimulus. We move on to Part E. Part E, assume the government lowers income tax rates to eliminate the recessionary gap. Will each of the following increase, decrease, or stay the same? And we need explanations. Aggregate demand, no graph needed, but we would just say that aggregate demand will increase, and that would be because consumption and business investment will increase if people have more money. So if we decrease income taxes, people have more money, and when they have more money, consumption and investment increases, and aggregate demand is, built on C plus G plus I plus NX. And so we have two of those variables that could be going up, and so aggregate demand goes up. Part E2, long run aggregate supply, explain. I would answer this one by saying it stays the same because inputs are not changed. If people get a tax rebate, that's great. They're going to spend that tax rebate, but that does not guarantee that our land, labor, or technology are being improved in any way. And so I'd say the inputs aren't changed, so therefore long-run aggregate supply stays the same. That would have actually gotten credit in 2015, but I guess when they went to grade this question in 2015, they had to acknowledge that there were other correct answers as well. Some students wrote things like long-run aggregate supply will increase because if investment is increasing, then we should see improvements being made to labor or capital as people are getting educated or as they're developing new technologies. And so we could actually see a long-run aggregate supply increase as a result of a tax decrease. So that also got credit in 2015. You could see this either way, as long as you explain why you said what you said. I think we're going to wrap it up with that. As always, let me know if you have questions. Keep up the hard work, and I'll see you on the next one.